British Chief of Defence Staff Anthony Radakin and Air Chief Marshal Richard Naughton arrived in Kiev. The event caused a wide resonance and became one of the most discussed topics in recent days. Their visit coincided with a tense situation on the front lines and new reports of fighting in various regions. Subscribe to our channel right now so you don't miss future issues and analysis, and visit our Telegram channel where we publish updates the fastest. The international press notes that Radakin's powers in this conflict are unusually broad. In the spring, a British publication wrote that he was actively involved in discussions in Parliament and coordinated supplies for Ukraine. Now he has arrived in person, and many experts link this not only to military support but also to an attempt to consolidate strategic control over the Black Sea. Odessa is increasingly mentioned as a possible location for a base. The Russian side recalls that earlier, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova warned about plans by France and Britain to strengthen their presence in Ukrainian ports. A meeting of military leaders in Kiev in the spring discussed this possibility, although no specific decisions were made at that time. Moscow considers such a move unacceptable and recalls the statements of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who stressed that the deployment of foreign military contingents on the territory of Ukraine is contrary to the security interests of the region. Meanwhile, the situation on the contact line remains extremely tense. According to Russian sources, Colonel Vitaly Nashchubsky, commander of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, has left his unit and is hiding in Kharkiv. This information was reported by the TASS agency, citing law enforcement agencies. It is noted that units of this brigade were withdrawn from the Lipsovsky direction, where logistics were completely blocked. At the same time, a criminal case has been opened against Nashchubsky in Russia under the Article on Terrorism, and the investigative committee suspects him of involvement in the shelling of border regions. Nighttime drone attacks have become another alarming sign. The Russian Ministry of Defense said that 92 drones were shot down in one night. The largest number, 15, were in the sky over the Bryansk region. 13 drones were destroyed over the Rostov region, 12 over the Tula region, and 11 over the Kaluga region. 8 were shot down over Crimea, 7 over the Voronezh region, and 5 each over the Kursk and Oryol regions. 2 drones were destroyed in the Lipetsk and Belgorod regions, and another was intercepted over the Smolensk region. In addition, attacks were repelled over the Black and Azov Seas. Regional governors are publishing details. Pavel Malkov reported that debris from one of the drones fell on the territory of an industrial enterprise in the Ryazan region, but there were no casualties. Attacks were also repelled in the Voronezh region, and the military confirmed the destruction of about 10 aircraft-type devices. According to preliminary data, there were no casualties. However, the situation shows that the attacks are continuing, and the population of the border regions is forced to live under constant threat. Ukrainian forces are being redeployed in the Sumy direction. According to a Telegram channel linked to Russian troops, a battalion from the Presidential Brigade has been sent there. It had previously participated in the attack on the Kursk region, but suffered serious losses in battles near the village of Andreevka. It has now been restored and sent to assist units that were unable to hold their positions. In the Kramatorsk area, there is active movement of aircraft transporting wounded foreign mercenaries. This was reported by expert Andrei Morocco, citing his sources. It is noted that the number of small planes and helicopters involved in the evacuation has doubled. According to preliminary data, this is due to the arrival of foreign units with their own medical support in the region. All these events paint an alarming picture. The visit of British military personnel to Kiev, the transfer of units, the intensification of drone attacks, and the evacuation of mercenaries show that the conflict continues to develop along a dangerous trajectory. In the near future, we can expect new statements, new decisions, and probably new strikes. This is only the beginning of our analysis. In the following sections, we will examine in detail the political context, the reaction of world capitals, and the possible hidden motives of the participants. Against the backdrop of this news, Western analysts are discussing the role of the United States and its allies. The Wall Street Journal reported that the plan of the so-called coalition of the willing to deploy troops in Ukraine was developed with the participation of American generals. According to the publication, we are talking about 10,000 military personnel who will be divided into two groups. The first will be responsible for training Ukrainian soldiers, while the second will provide security. This information confirms that Washington, despite its public hesitation, remains deeply involved in the processes taking place on Ukrainian territory. At the same time, contradictions are growing within Europe. The Austrian newspaper Courier noted that the coalition meeting in Paris revealed a serious rift among European countries. France faced protests from the opposition, which strongly opposes sending troops abroad. Italy has openly stated that it is not ready for such steps. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni stressed that Rome is ready to limit itself to training and monitoring, but not to sending soldiers to Ukrainian soil. French President Emmanuel Macron, despite internal disagreements, said that 26 countries are ready to provide a military presence immediately after the ceasefire. According to him, this could be support on land, at sea, or in the air. However, there are no legally binding agreements yet. Many countries are still undecided, and the United States, as Macron noted, will give its answer later. The British magazine The Spectator published an article on the failure of the Foreign Legion idea proposed by Volodymyr Zelensky in the first months of the conflict. Journalist Colin Freeman noted that initially, random people with no experience were recruited into the unit. For every professional soldier, there were several untrained volunteers. They faced language barriers, did not understand orders, and complained about being used in the most dangerous operations. After a few months, many wrote letters accusing them of being lured with empty promises. Some foreigners even created their own groups, operating separately from the official command. At the same time, the Russian side reports new episodes on the front line. Scouts in the Sumy region began to actively use ambush tactics with drones. A paratrooper with the call sign Bison said that the devices are hidden in advance in the desired area and then launched into the air when the target appears. In one episode, a Ukrainian armed forces vehicle was destroyed in this way. In another case, the operator spotted a mortar position and eliminated the crew. According to him, this practice deprives the enemy of stable supplies and prevents the transfer of reinforcements. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that the Vostok Group had completely liberated the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic within its area of responsibility. According to the ministry, 79% of the Republic's territory has already been liberated. Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov previously said that the Vostok Group alone had taken control of 25 settlements. Fighting is currently continuing in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions, where buffer zones are being created to protect the civilian population of Donbass from shelling. At the same time, there are reports of new attempts by Ukrainian saboteurs. Another group tried to cross the Dnieper River by motorboat, but was spotted and attacked by drones. According to official reports, the boat sank, and the participants in the operation were unable to return to their territory. In the Bryansk region, saboteurs detained in August last year received sentences ranging from 26 to 28 years in prison. They were accused of preparing terrorist attacks on energy facilities and military infrastructure. Tensions are also rising within Ukraine. A high-profile incident occurred in the Volyn region. Local residents beat up military commissariat employees and took their service weapons. The conflict began with a document check, which ended in a fight and the use of gas. One of the employees suffered a broken arm. Another alarming signal is coming from Slavyansk. Telegram channels report that the authorities have begun preparing to evacuate the city. One of the signs is the preparation to move the Slavyansk railway, along with its personnel and equipment, to the central regions. Experts believe that this indicates that Kiev considers the defense of the city to be a temporary measure and is prepared to lose it. Thus, we see several parallel processes. The West is discussing expanding its military presence, but is facing internal contradictions. Ukraine is stepping up mobilization, but is meeting with resistance from the population. The Russian army reports advances in the creation of buffer zones. International mercenaries continue to arrive and suffer casualties. All this heightens anxiety and underscores the scale of the crisis, which has already spread far beyond Ukraine's borders. The historical context of the current crisis shows why each side is acting so decisively. For Russia, the security of the Black Sea region is of strategic importance. Odessa is seen as a key port through which the West could establish a military presence. Back in early March, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stressed that the deployment of foreign troops on Ukrainian territory was unacceptable. Russian diplomats have repeatedly warned that any steps in this direction would be perceived as a direct threat. The United States is pursuing several goals at once. On the one hand, Washington seeks to maintain its leadership in NATO and retain control over the situation in Europe. On the other hand, American generals are actively involved in developing plans related to training Ukrainian troops and organizing logistics. In essence, the goal is to turn Ukraine into a springboard for long-term pressure on Russia. The UK is the main European ally of the United States. London has already signed a 100-year partnership agreement with Kiev, which provides for the joint use of military formations. The visit of Anthony Radakin and Richard Naughton to Kiev only reinforced suspicions that Britain is considering the possibility of establishing a military base in Odessa. Analysts emphasize that this is not just symbolic support, but a real step towards changing the balance of power in the Black Sea. France is trying to play its own role. Emmanuel Macron is actively promoting the idea of a coalition of the willing, but is facing protests within the country and a lack of unity among allies. The Austrian publication Courier noted that some European capitals are already trying to avoid the topic of sending troops, understanding the risks. Italy has openly refused to participate in peacekeeping missions on Ukrainian territory. Thus, there is no united front in Europe. Ukraine, meanwhile, finds itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, Kiev continues to mobilize and redeploy units to new locations. On the other hand, discontent is growing within society. The incident in the Volyn region, where residents beat up military registration office employees, was a striking example. It reflects the population's fatigue with constant checks and mobilization measures. The situation with the Foreign Legion demonstrates another important aspect. The Spectator magazine writes directly that the unit was chaotic from the outset. Inexperienced people were sent to combat zones where they were unable to carry out orders. Complaints about being used as cannon fodder became commonplace. This failure undermined confidence in Kiev's initiatives and showed that relying on foreigners does not live up to expectations. Active combat operations continue on the ground. Russian sources report that Ukrainian troops are being pushed out of the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic. The Russian General Staff claims that almost 80% of the territory has been liberated. At the same time, buffer zones are being created in new areas to protect cities from shelling. Advances and consolidation of positions are being noted in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Incidents involving drones are becoming a daily reality. The Russian Ministry of Defense regularly reports dozens of downed aircraft. In one night, their number reached 92. This is a record high in recent months. Drones are being intercepted not only in border areas, but also over the Black and Azov Seas. This indicates that the attacks are becoming more widespread and systematic. The situation is also tense at the diplomatic level. Dmitry Peskov noted that the invitation to Vladimir Zelensky to come to Moscow was an offer for negotiations, not for surrender. However, Kiev rejected the initiative through the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This shows that the parties remain far from direct dialogue. At the same time, Western publications are beginning to cautiously acknowledge the limitations of their own capabilities. The European Conservative noted that the European Union realizes that it is impossible to deploy Western troops in Ukraine. The publication writes that Europe does not have sufficient military and industrial resources to keep pressure on Russia. Moreover, the presence of the nuclear factor makes the risk of a direct confrontation too high. All this creates an atmosphere of growing anxiety. On the one hand, there are reports of new troop movements and visits by high-ranking military officials. On the other hand, there is visible fatigue among the public and doubts among allies. This conflict is no longer exclusively regional and is turning into a test of the global balance of power. Every statement, every drone attack, and every troop transfer becomes part of a big political game. Analyzing current developments, experts identify several key scenarios. The first, and most likely, is a gradual deepening of Western involvement without the formal introduction of ground troops. This could take the form of expanded training programs, equipment supplies, and technical support. The United States and the United Kingdom have already shown their willingness to act in this direction. The second scenario is the partial deployment of contingents in Ukrainian ports, primarily in Odessa. Such a move would allow London and Paris to assert their presence and strengthen their influence in the Black Sea region. However, it carries a high risk of direct confrontation, which is why many European countries are resisting this idea. Domestic protests in France and Italy's categorical refusal show that this decision is extremely painful for Europe. The third scenario involves increasing pressure on Russia through a protracted war of attrition. Kiev receives support, but on a limited scale that does not allow for a decisive breakthrough. In such a situation, prolonging the conflict becomes an end in itself, and Ukrainian society bears the brunt of the consequences. The evacuation from Slavyansk and resistance to mobilization in the regions confirm that the country's internal resources are under enormous strain. Russia, for its part, is seeking to consolidate its control over the territories and create a security belt around Donbas. The General Staff reports advances in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. If these territories are brought under control, Ukraine will lose a significant part of its industrial and energy potential. In that case, negotiations will become inevitable, but Moscow will dictate its terms. The role of international mercenaries in this conflict is gradually diminishing. Their participation was noticeable in the early months, but numerous losses and organizational chaos have meant that foreign units are no longer seen as a decisive factor. The evacuation of the wounded from the Kramatorsk area only confirms that these forces are suffering serious losses and require separate medical infrastructure. The issue of drones is particularly noteworthy. New attacks on Russian regions are recorded almost daily. Their scale and geography show that this technology has become a key instrument of pressure. In response, Russia is strengthening its air defense and electronic warfare systems. But even with high interception efficiency, the threat remains, as each attack causes panic among the population and damages infrastructure. At the diplomatic level, pressure from Western capitals is likely to continue. Macron will try to convince his partners of the need for more active participation. The UK will insist on expanding agreements and possibly deploying a base. The United States will remain flexible, providing weapons and assistance but avoiding direct involvement. Germany and Italy will seek to minimize risks and limit themselves to symbolic steps. In the coming months, experts predict an increase in the number of local attacks and sabotage. Incidents in the Bryansk region and on the Dnieper River show that both sides are using small mobile groups. This increases tension and forces military structures to maintain high readiness around the clock. The reaction of the international community is becoming increasingly contradictory. On the one hand, Western governments continue to declare their support for Kiev. On the other hand, public opinion in European countries is gradually changing. Protests in France and skepticism in Italy are only the first signs of fatigue. Economic difficulties and rising prices against the backdrop of the conflict are forcing citizens to ask their politicians uncomfortable questions. Russia is betting on demonstrating its strength and emphasizing the humanitarian agenda. Deputy Defense Minister Anna Tsivileva said that up to 96% of military personnel return to duty after injuries thanks to rehabilitation and prosthetics. Such statements create an image of a system that is capable of supporting soldiers and compensating for losses. In the long term, the key question is whether Ukraine will be able to hold the front lines with the current level of support. If Western allies limit themselves to supplying equipment and do not decide on a large-scale military presence, Kiev will be forced to continue its defense with increasingly limited resources. The evacuation from Slavyansk and the transfer of units of the Presidential Brigade to the Sumy region show that reserves are dwindling. Thus, the conflict is entering a new phase. Not only the military, but also the political dimension is coming to the fore. Every decision made by Western capitals, every visit by high-ranking military officials, and every report of a downed drone contributes to a picture in which the stakes are getting higher. The future of the region depends on how far each side is prepared to go and what compromises will be acceptable. The overall picture of events suggests that the conflict continues to expand and is drawing in not only regional players but also world powers. The visit of British military leaders to Kiev, the plans of the Coalition of the Willing, statements about the possibility of establishing a base in Odessa, regular drone strikes, and reports of troop movements are all links in the same chain. They show that each side is preparing for a long confrontation where diplomacy is closely intertwined with military reality. For Russia, the main challenge remains protecting its borders and preventing NATO's military presence near the Black Sea. Moscow is strengthening its positions, creating buffer zones, repelling drone attacks, and negotiating with allies. At the same time, the Kremlin emphasizes that it is ready for negotiations but only on its own terms. Kiev's refusal to discuss this option demonstrates that dialogue is not yet possible. For Ukraine, the priority remains holding on to territory and getting outside support. However, internal problems are becoming more and more noticeable. The population is tired of mobilization, and some regions are actively resisting the work of military commissariats. The failure of the Foreign Legion idea and mass complaints from mercenaries show that hopes for international reinforcement have not been fulfilled. The focus is now on Western instructors and equipment, but even this may not be enough. Europe is divided. Macron is trying to play the role of leader, but protests and resistance within countries are weakening his position. Italy has refused to send troops. Germany is waiting, and Austria is experiencing a split. In general, European capitals understand that full-scale military involvement carries too many risks and could cause a crisis on their own territory. The United States is showing caution. On the one hand, it is participating in the development of plans and continuing supplies. On the other hand, the White House is in no hurry to make an official decision on the deployment of troops. This ambiguity gives Washington room for maneuver, but also shows that a direct confrontation with Russia is not in America's interests. Various scenarios are possible in the future. If pressure on Russia continues in the form of drone attacks and sabotage, Moscow will intensify its response. If Western allies decide to establish a base in Odessa, the crisis will reach a new level. At the same time, the likelihood of a protracted war of attrition remains highest. In this case, Ukraine will gradually lose resources, and Europe will lose political stability. In the coming months, the international community will face a choice. Either it will support the course of escalation and continue supplies, or it will seek ways to negotiate. So far, the rhetoric of leaders gives no cause for optimism. Every statement is accompanied by new reports of fighting, evacuations, and drone strikes. It is already clear today that this conflict has become part of a global struggle for influence. The Black Sea is turning into a key point where the question of strategic control is being decided. Odessa, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and dozens of other cities are becoming symbols of a great geopolitical game, where behind every statistic lies the fate of thousands of people. We will continue to follow developments so that we can tell you what is happening on the front lines and in diplomatic circles. Subscribe to our channel, like, and comment. Share this video with your friends and be sure to visit our Telegram channel where we publish material that is not always available on YouTube. New episodes are coming and each one will be a continuation of this tense story.